Hey guys, today I'll be making one of my final 2022 Senate map predictions as we're only 6 days away from the midterm elections on November 8th. We're already in the month of November, so these races are going to occur very soon, and we're going to know who the winners in these 35 elections are going to be in under a week. So looking at the map, we have a bunch of very solid races for both parties, but also some very competitive races that Democrats and Republicans are defending. Right now, the races that Democrats have to win if they want to retain the majority are Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and New Hampshire. As long as they can win all 4 of these states, they will win at least 50 seats. They might even flip Pennsylvania. Now, for the GOP, what they have to do is retain their seats in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, North Carolina. The latter 3 will be easy for the GOP to do, but Pennsylvania, we still have a very close race there between John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz, and then they also have to flip at least 1 out of the 3 seats in Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, and right now it looks as if Nevada is going to be their prime target. And so for this video, we're going to use a very defined ratings. It's not just going to be by how competitive a race is going to be. It's really just going to be based off of the actual margin the parties are going to win by. As election day nears, we're going to have a much better picture of how candidates are actually going to do percentage-wise. So starting off with the solid states, these are going to be races that either party is going to win by at least 15 points. Democrats have a couple of them, but really not too many. At this point, I can only give them 5 solid states, while the Republican Party does have significantly more. I don't believe Utah is going to be solid GOP right now, as Mike Lee is really not performing that well against Evan McMullin, but Eric Schmidt is going to defeat Trudy Bush Valentine by a solid margin in Missouri, and Todd Young as well as Rand Paul, who only won by likely margins in 2016, are also on track to winning by at least 15 points this year. So with the solid states filled in, we have 43 states for the Republicans, 41 for the Democrats, and we have 16 races remaining. And so when going over these elections, we have likely, lean, and tilt ratings. So likely is going to be a margin between 5 to 15%. Lean is from 1 to 5, and then anything less than 1% is going to make that state a tilt one. So we're going to go over some races that I don't think should be talked about too much, but are notable because they're no longer solid for either one party. So for Democrats, we have the states of Illinois, New York, and Connecticut. Of course, they're going to win all 3 of these states. These are all states that voted for Joe Biden by solid margins in 2020. 20% in Connecticut. In New York, it was 23% and 17% in Illinois. But the incumbents in these 3 states are still going to do well, but just not as well as they did in 2016. In Connecticut, we have Richard Blumenthal, Chuck Schumer in New York, and Tammy Duckworth in Illinois. So this is going to give Democrats 44 seats. These are all states that Democrats have an over 99% chance at winning, but the margin simply isn't going to be over 15 points. And there aren't really too many of these states for Republicans, because the races that they're going to win by likely margins are going to be elections that are going to be more competitive. And so the first of these states that we're going to analyze closely is going to be the one in Utah, where Mike Lee is running for re-election against Evan McMullin, and this is going to be one of the most interesting races to watch because Democrats don't have their own candidate there. Instead, they've endorsed conservative independent Evan McMullin, who is challenging the incumbent Senator Mike Lee. Mike Lee leads by 9.8% in the polling, but honestly, he's doing terribly compared to where he was in 2016. Lee won his first term 6 years ago by a 41% margin. And the reason why Lee is doing so poorly this time around is because he's aligned himself way too closely with Donald Trump, who is not popular in the state. McMullin, as a conservative, is much more of a viable option for many voters because he is to the right, but also not as closely aligned with the former president. In fact, Mike Lee does not even have the endorsement of Mitt Romney, who is choosing not to support anyone in the race. And so at this point in time, McMullin does not have enough time to garner the support that he needs to actually win, but he will make Utah a competitive state, and it will not be solid for the Republican Party. Next up, we have the most competitive election in 4 decades for the seat that Chuck Grassley currently holds. He is a 7-time incumbent and now running for his 8th term. He is being challenged by Democrat Michael Franken, who is a former Navy Vice Admiral. Vice Admiral is basically the 2nd highest achievable rank currently in the United States Navy, and Grassley leads only by 7.2% in the polling for his re-election. In 2016, Grassley won a 7th term by 20 points. In 2010, he won by 30 points, and in 2004, he defeated his Democratic opponent by over 40 percentage points. The election in Iowa this year is going to be the closest one for Chuck Grassley since his first one 40 years ago in 1980. In fact, Chuck Grassley is so old that if he serves out his next term until 2029, he'll be closer to 100 than he is to 90. And age is the reason why Michael Franken is doing so well. Yes, Franken is a strong candidate, and against a more generic Republican, he will probably do better. But Chuck Grassley, him up by 7.2% is an abysmal margin for compared to where he was just 6 years ago. And 2022 is supposed to be a red wave year, so Grassley should be winning by 20 to 30 points, but Michael Franken is running a strong campaign, combined with the fact that as Chuck Grassley has aged, his electoral prowess has weakened pretty significantly. And so all those factors combined is going to make Iowa only a likely Republican state. It's pretty clear now that Chuck Grassley is not going to win by the solid margins that he's used to. And now we're going to move on to the final likely Democratic state on this map, and that is going to be Colorado, not Washington, but Colorado, where Michael Bennet is running for re-election to a third full term. And so we're going to go through all the likely states first, and then lean and then end off with the tilt states that are really going to decide the balance of power for the next 2 years. So in Colorado, Joe Day is the Republican challenger to Michael Bennet, and his campaign really hasn't taken off. Bennet leads by 10 points in the polling average, and most polls show him up by a double-digit margin. In fact, according to Emerson College, Bennet leads by 8 points, and Emerson College does tend to be a pollster that overestimates Republicans just a little bit, not as much as the Trafalgar Group, but still a pollster with a right-leaning bias. And so Michael Bennet up by 10 points is pretty significant because he only won by 5% in 2016. It was not even a likely margin back then, but this year, even though it's going to be a red wave year, Bennet is currently expected to do much better than he did last time. Joe Biden did win Colorado by 14 points in 2020. Of course, Michael Bennet isn't going to do better than Biden, but he is still going to win by a pretty impressive margin, making Colorado a likely Democratic state, even though Washington is not going to be one. And so with this call, we're now only left with 4 more likely states, and they're all going to go to the GOP. But the first one that I'm going to cover is Florida, because the other 3 races I think go together pretty well. But in the Sunshine State, Marco Rubio is going to win by almost a double-digit margin, if not actually a double-digit margin. He won by 8 points in 2016, so winning by over 10% is not going to be that difficult. In the polling, Rubio leads by 7 points. Val Demings was a strong Democratic candidate, but in the environment that is 2022, Val Demings simply is not going to win. And of course, Florida is a state that's shifting more and more to the right, as of course Donald Trump actually won Florida by a much larger margin in 2020 than he did in 2016. The Democratic Party probably is not going to win any major races in Florida for the next decade, as right now there's only one major statewide Democratic official, and that is Nikki Fried, who is only the agricultural commissioner. Ron DeSantis, of course, isn't going to lose re-election as governor, and nor is Marco Rubio. Rubio is going to win his re-election, not by a solid margin, but it is going to be a pretty impressive victory considering that this is the state of Florida. And now we've got 3 more races left. These, I think, are grouped together pretty well: Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina. All 3 of these races were potential flips for Democrats a few months back, but as election day nears, it's unlikely that they're going to win, as the Republican candidates in these states are seeing increases in support. And most dramatically, that is occurring in Wisconsin, where Ron Johnson is running for re-election to a 3rd term, despite winning in 2016 and pledging that he would not run again 6 years later. But Ron Johnson right now leads by 4.5% in the polling and is in a very strong position to win his re-election against Mandela Barnes. Ron Johnson outperformed polling expectations 6 years ago as well as 12 years ago when he won his first term in 2010. And so with Mandela Barnes behind in the polling by so much, Ron Johnson is almost guaranteed a victory and is going to win by at least 5%. Polls in Wisconsin have been known to overestimate Democratic support, and that's likely what's going to happen again here in 2022. The only poll right now that shows Barnes in the lead is a poll conducted by his very own campaign. Even though Barack Obama went campaigning with Barnes just a couple of days ago in Wisconsin, it's really not going to make that much of a difference, and Wisconsin is going to be the 4th likely state for Republicans. Next up, we have the state of Ohio, where J.D. Vance is running against Tim Ryan to succeed Rob Portman, who will be retiring after 3 terms in the Senate early next year. And so this race was perceived as a potential flip for Tim Ryan because J.D. Vance was just not a good candidate for the GOP to choose, while Tim Ryan was a 10-term congressman who has won re-election countless times in his swing district. And so Tim Ryan will not be running for re-election for his House seat and will instead be running for the Senate. And J.D. Vance here leads by 2% against the Democratic nominee. Now, this polling average I think is going to be pretty wrong in the end. J.D. Vance is going to win by at least 5 points. And that's because when you look at the actual polls that are reputable, J.D. Vance does lead by pretty significant margins. Signal has Vance up by 5. The previous poll had him up by 4. And the only polls right now that are having Ryan in the lead are polls conducted by Democratic super PACs, as well as some polls with lesser ratings. When you look at the better pollsters, J.D. Vance has the clear advantage. And of course, Ohio is another state, just like Wisconsin, where Democrats are known to be overestimated in the polling. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was expected to win Ohio, as well as Joe Biden in 2020, but Trump won the state by 8 points both times. And so as of this point in time, Ohio is not looking like it's going to flip. It's going to be a hold for the Republicans as J.D. Vance wins his election to a first term, succeeding Rob Portman. And finally, we have just one more likely state left, and that is going to be North Carolina, where Ted Budd runs against Cheri Beasley, and they're both vying for the seat currently held by Richard Burr. Burr is retiring. He won by 5 points in 2016, and with the national environment so much better for Republicans this year than it was 6 years ago, Ted Budd is probably going to win by over 5 points. He leads by 3 points in the polling. There was actually a point in time when Cheri Beasley led against Ted Budd in early September, but that is no longer the case. Ted Budd has taken a pretty strong lead, and it's clear the Democrats are not going to flip this seat this year. They've tried very hard in the past elections in the state over the last decade. I mean, 2020, Cal Cunningham had a very good chance at flipping the seat held by Tom Tillis, but Democrats have not won a single Senate race in the Tar Heel state since 2008 when Kay Hagan was elected, and that was a one-time occurrence. Democrats, even though they've been competitive in North Carolina over the last few years, they have not been able to win any major election except for the governor race that went to Roy Cooper. And so when looking at all 3 of these races, North Carolina, Ohio, and Wisconsin, the Republican nominees are not leading by double digits or likely margins in the polling, but they have a very good chance at winning by those margins because in all 3 of these states, like I've said many times in this video already, polling is not going to be right, and polling is almost always favoring Democrats in these 3 states. And so that's why, even though Republicans aren't doing that well, if you just look at the numbers, in the end, they're probably going to win by much larger margins than you think. And so with all the likely states on our map, we have 49 seats for Republicans, 45 for Democrats. Democrats obviously aren't in the position they wanted to be in at this point with just 6 days to go. They were doing much better just 1 month ago, but they've lost a lot of the leads that they had in the key races, and they're starting to see their support slip even in some of the most solid Democratic states. And a perfect example of that is Washington, where Tiffany Smiley is giving Patty Murray a run for her money. Of course, Patty Murray is still going to win. She's not going to lose her re-election to a 5th term in one of the most solid states in the country, but she is still doing terribly when compared to how well she did in 2016. She won by 18 points against Chris Vance and won a 4th term, and this year she is still going to win a 5th, but just not by anywhere near a solid margin, not even a likely margin at this point, because Tiffany Smiley has been polling much better over just the last few days. In fact, the latest Trafalgar poll only has Murray ahead by 1%, and so at this point I give Patty Murray a margin of victory of around 3 to 4%, maybe even down to just 2%, but it's still going to be a win for Democrats. Patty Murray is not going to lose. It's just not going to be by the strongest margin that she wins by. And yes, Colorado is going to vote to the left of Washington, simply because Michael Bennet is performing better than Patty Murray. In Pennsylvania, we have an election that was supposed to be the saving grace for Democrats. Democrats were always going to lose 1 seat out of Nevada, Arizona, or Georgia, at least 1, but if they could flip Pennsylvania, they would have had a much better chance at winning at least 50 seats a second time in a row. But the race in Pennsylvania slipped away from John Fetterman simply as a result of his health issues. He suffered a stroke just 5 days before the Democratic primary in late May, and Fetterman, his lead has shrunk down to just 1.1% because Fetterman hasn't really been able to go out on the campaign trail because he's been recovering for such a long time, and his debate performance on the 25th of October was terrible. If you look at the polls released before the debate, every single one of them had Fetterman winning, and then all the polls afterwards showed Oz in the lead. And so Oz basically took the lead overnight, and even though Fetterman leads by 1.1%, his lead is going to basically disappear, and it's going to show Oz ahead. And the reason why Fetterman's still ahead is because the polling does take some time to adjust, as Fetterman was ahead for such a long time, because this is a weighted average. So Pennsylvania is going to be a lean Republican state for right now. Mehmet Oz has the clear advantage. If John Fetterman was in good condition, he was in good health, he would win this election, and Democrats would be in a much better position. Next up, we have an election in New Hampshire that is also surprisingly close, because Maggie Hassan's lead in the polling has dropped down to just 2.8% against Don Bolduc. In fact, the most recent poll even shows Bolduc ahead of the incumbent Democrat. Now, Maggie Hassan won a very tough election in 2016, where she won her seat by defeating incumbent Kelly Ayotte by a 0.14% margin. This was a very difficult victory, and honestly, a pretty impressive one for Hassan. She's also the former governor of New Hampshire. She served 2 terms, 4 years as governor of the Granite State. She was Chris News' direct predecessor, but this year she is facing a very tough challenge as she attempts to win a second term in the Senate. Now, Maggie Hassan is still favored. She is still probably going to win, but the race is definitely much closer than it was just a few weeks back when Hassan led by 8 points on average. Bolduc is not the best nominee. If the GOP had gone with Chuck Morse, I do believe that this state could be categorized as tilt Republican, but right now, with Bolduc as the one that Republicans went with, Maggie Hassan is still favored, and New Hampshire is going to be a lean Democratic state. And the final lean state on this map is going to be Nevada, where Republicans are favored with Adam Laxalt on track to defeat Catherine Cortez Masto. Laxalt leads by 0.2% in the polling, and despite Masto being ahead for almost the entirety of the election cycle until late September, she was never really in that good of a position. Masto simply isn't that strong of a candidate, and combined with the fact that Nevada isn't as favorable for Democrats as it was just a decade ago, she was always going to struggle. In fact, the latest Emerson College poll has Laxalt ahead by 5%, Adam Laxalt up by 0.2 on average. That is probably going to translate to a margin of victory of at least over 1%, but the election in Nevada is going to be very, very close nonetheless. Masto still has a chance, and she may surprise us, but when looking at all the data together, of course, Republicans gaining momentum nationwide, it does seem unlikely that she's actually going to win a second term. Steve Sisolak isn't faring any better in the governor election. Joe Lombardo is expected to win that race, and so Democrats are going to lose both major offices in the Silver State. In 2018, they did very well with Jackie Rosen defeating incumbent Dean Heller by 5 points, but again, 2022 is not going to be the same as 2018. Democrats were in a much better position back then, and so as a result of the shifting national environment, as well as shifting demographics in Nevada, the state is going to be a lean Republican one, at least for now. And so this will give Republicans their 51st seat, which means that without Georgia and without that runoff election, Republicans can already win a majority just on the 8th of November. But Democrats do still have a chance in Nevada, even though it's lean. It's not impossible for Masto to pull out a victory. Maybe something's going to happen there and she surprises us all, but at this point, it's not likely, which means that Republicans are probably going to take back the majority. But I do still have Arizona as going to Mark Kelly. Mark Kelly is a pretty strong incumbent, and flipping this state should be very easy for the GOP. I mean, it barely voted for Joe Biden in 2020. Mark Kelly only won by 2 points for a Senate election. Flipping a seat that the incumbent won by 2 points 6 years ago is not that difficult, especially in a state like Arizona, a state that is one of the most purple ones in the country. And Kelly right now leads by 3 points in the polling. Masters is at 45, Kelly at 48. But so far, Blake Masters has not led in any poll that's ever been released over the course of the last year. And so with Mark Kelly still maintaining a strong position, even though this race has tightened, he is on track to winning re-election. It'll just be by a very, very small margin. And finally, in Georgia, of course, the election is not going to be decided on the 8th. Herschel Walker nor Raphael Warnock are going to get to 50%. I think that in the first round, Walker is going to win by a very small margin, but it's not going to be decided as a majority is needed to win the seat. Warnock won it in a runoff in 2021 against Kelly Loeffler, but when looking at the other races on this map, that's what's going to give the GOP the victory this year, because in Georgia, this is not going to be the Democrats' 50th seat. This is going to be their 49th seat, which means that even if Democrats win Georgia, nothing is really going to change. Warnock will win re-election, but Democrats are still going to lose the majority anyways. And so because of that, Republicans are going to have the momentum going into the election because they just won a sweeping victory, and they're also going to flip the House as well as win many more governorships, which is why the state of Georgia is going to be in the Republican column, although it'll be a tilt race, because at this point, it's going to still be very, very close. Warnock is a strong incumbent, but the race right now in the Peach State is going to depend on how well Democrats and Republicans do nationwide in the other races that we have. And so with just 6 days to go, this is my updated 2022 Senate map prediction: 52 for Republicans, 48 for Democrats. It's still going to be close. Democrats still have a chance if they can flip Nevada, which will make them do better in Georgia. But at this point, it seems unlikely, and more likely than not, that Republicans are going to take back the majority with at least 51 or maybe even 52 seats. And so that'll be it for this video. Make sure you like it down below. If you enjoyed, comment down below which party you think will win the majority. If you disagree with me, I completely respect that, but please at least give me a chance, and we'll compare results on the 8th. And then subscribe to my channel if you haven't. I will also be doing a live stream on the 8th of November covering every single election, the House, Governor, Senate races, all of that. So make sure you join for that in 6 days, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.